Welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Lens. This is Jake along with Scott, and we're not talking bourbon tonight. We're going across the pond. We're headed to Scotland, but our guest is from California. Do the math on that one, guys. And we are talking to Craig Bridger from Whyte and Mackay, who is the head of advocacy. But more importantly, we're going to be talking about the Dalmore tonight, and we'll get to the other brands on an episode later down the road. So, Craig, thanks for joining Scott and I tonight.
Gents, thank you so much, and thank you for making the trip all the way out here across the pond to come and see me on this Monday evening.
Across the pond to California.
Yeah, across the pond to California. A couple time zones anyway. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to talking to you guys.
Yeah, so how many bourbon people do you have reaching out to you to learn about Scotch or single malt these days?
You two gentlemen are the first that come with a podcast, I'll tell you that. But in all seriousness, there's more crossover than you might expect once you start chatting with people who are just at heart true whiskey fans, and that enthusiasm may first take hold with the legendary whiskeys of Kentucky and our national spirit bourbon, or with something with a bit more history, like an Irish whiskey or a single malt Scotch whiskey. But I've come to realize that enthusiasm for one, if you stay with it for long enough, will probably lead you to others that are all in the category of whiskey.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And, for the record, I think we'll dive into this because Scott and I just got the appropriate training from Moonshine University here around how do you spell whiskey. Yeah. And for the Scotch, it would be with no E, right? It's
That's right.
Whisky.
Correct.
So we want to make sure that everything we do here tonight is about the Dalmore and whiskey with no E.
When you're pronouncing whiskey, gentlemen, with me, please pronounce it without the E. Okay, it's very important. Yeah. There's so many interesting little stories about the development of the modern whiskey industry, and I've always heard. I can't promise that it's historically accurate, but I've always heard that. The Scots ended up with that unusual spelling of whiskey because before we had sort of codified dictionary definitions and spellings of everything, different communities had different ways of spelling words in common use, and the Irish had sort of settled on spelling whiskey with an E. The Scots, ever determined to go their own way, left the E off. And it was, to a large extent, immigrants from Ireland farming and bringing their knowledge of distilling that started the fledgling whiskey industry in the United States. And so they brought with them, in addition to their know-how, their way of spelling the word. So the American industry sort of inherited that, and the Scots have sort of resolutely stuck with the spelling without the E.
Well, there we go. So, what's really interesting, and you've hit on it, there's storied brands and storied production, right? When we think about America, we are a relatively young country and young in our spirit production. And we took a little break called Prohibition along the way.
Indeed.
In that process. And the Scots never stopped. So in the grand scheme of things, how old is the Dalmore, and where do they sit in the lineage of heritage brands? We use that term here, in Kentucky for all the heritage distilleries. Where do they sit in that heritage, space from a Scotch?
It's a great question. And there's so many ways you could take a look at that. I might start with a bit earlier, a bit further back through the sands of time than the Dalmore, to just pause and say our first written record referencing Scotch whiskey was in 1494 on the King's Exchequer rolls, which is keeping track of how the crown was sort of spending its money. And so what we take from that little tidbit is that the making and enjoyment of malt whiskey in Scotland has been around for centuries. This is an industry that's absolutely steeped in history and heritage, in practice handed down, and that's one of the reasons I love it so much. When you say heritage brands, the ones that I'm thinking of in Scotland, for the most part, with some exception, start to show up after the English Excise Act of 1824, which reduced the taxes that were being levied by the crown on legal distilling operations, and that was the death knell for smugglers, which up to that point were just like running rampant through the Highlands, and the beginning of what we would now call the modern Scotch whiskey industry. And you start to see some very iconic brands come online right after that, like the Glenlivet and others in the lovely Speyside Valley. A few years after that, the Dalmore in the Northern Highlands of Scotland comes online in 1839. So in September of that year, spirit first started flowing from these copper pot stills at the Dalmore. So
it's not young by any stretch of the imagination.
It's not young by any stretch of the imagination. We have been about the business of making this very soft, elegant single malt for nearly 200 years now.
Just put that in perspective, guys. Kentucky's barely 200 years old. Like when you think about those things, it just really kind of, makes it all kind of come together. So, for the average drinker, a lot of times they're like, hey, I'm a bourbon person. I like corn. I like sweetness and all those things. And they, don't really understand Scotch. And they're like, hey, I'm used to all this high proof.
Right.
And I don't get why, like, I should be excited about an 80 proof or an 84 proof, whiskey. So for you, as you sit down at a bar and you're talking through something, or you're talking through a tasting class, and you're bringing the message, the good word of the Dalmore to the people.
Yeah. Spreading the gospel.
How do you, spreading the Dalmore gospel. How do you, broach that person that's like, well, there's just not enough proof. There's not enough flavor here. And I know we're not talking about the brand specifically yet, but I think this is the key thing for whiskey drinkers, bourbon, maybe thinking about Scotch in particular, need to understand in my estimation.
First of all, I would welcome that question. That's going to make me excited. If someone comes up to me and says, here's my thing, I really like high proof whiskeys with a lot of muscle, a lot of character. I'm immediately engaged with that person because what I learned from that is that's somebody who's drinking a lot of whiskey and loves whiskey and has really developed a palate for whiskey. Because if you haven't, you don't want to go anywhere near a Booker's or something that's delivering that kind of punch. Part of the reason for that is really a difference in tradition. Traditionally, the Scots bottle and enjoy their whiskeys at a lower proof, what they would call drinking proof, or maybe I would just call it that. I think I'm making up a phrase here. That I would call it drinking proof. And there's more of a tradition in bourbon and in American whiskey for things that are bottled in bond or indeed cask strength or barrel proof. What I would say is I agree. I love a real powerful bourbon as well, and I also love the opportunity to taste a single malt straight from the cask. But I think that the two things are not mutually exclusive. That you're either going to have proof and flavor, higher proof and flavor, or neither. I think that if you're open to investigating it a little further, you might find, and partly because you're going to see so many different types of casks used in the maturation process in Scotch whiskey than you typically do in bourbon. You're going to, I hope, find that there's lots of flavors that can be pulled from those casks and can be experienced in maybe a more meditative way than something as fiery as a George T. Stagg.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really nuanced way to put it. And for me, that's what it was, the realization. I just had to try it to get over myself. Mm-hmm. Scott, I don't know about you. Like when we first started talking single malts and Scotch, we're not high proof drinkers traditionally over here, but you kind of have to get over yourself a little bit to hey, 80 proof is it going to have flavor or not? Right.
Yeah. And look, this doesn't mean you won't have personal preferences, and that's absolutely, not only is it okay, but we have to welcome that, right? Because there are a few things as individual to you as what you smell and taste. So I totally get that. That's a huge part of this. I just hope that someone who has decided that their preference is for really high proof whiskeys might also at least be open to trying some other pretty fantastic offerings that don't bottle as high. And to be honest, I can drink some whiskey, as I bet you guys can, but when you're drinking it at much higher than 90 proof, you're kind of anesthetizing your palate. Even if you're real tough and that's how you like it, and you can kick back a lot of it, the alcohol is putting your taste buds to sleep a little bit. So you're not picking up as much flavor as you might if you drop a little water in that and get it down to about 80 proof, or maybe 84 proof, somewhere around there.
Yeah, if you're having one drink a night, 120 proof is fine. But after a couple of them, like you said, your palate can be shot, especially if you're not careful, drinking lots of water in between, in between and things like that. So yeah. I prefer right around 100 proof, and that's kind of where I'm comfortable with. But then again, it's corn. It's corn whiskey is what I like at 100 proof. Yeah. But with Scotch too, I think a lot of it is just education, because people hear Scotch from Kentucky or anywhere in the U.S. and they're probably like, "Oh, it's got to have lots of smoke, and it probably tastes like campfire and things like that." Right. And that's just not true. Yes, there are some, and those that do exist that they are sometimes over the top, especially for an American whiskey drinker. Yeah, but they're sort looking at other regions.
Yeah. I mean, those whiskeys in particular, they can be very polarizing. I think of them as the Scotch whiskey equivalent of a massively hopped craft beer. That some people are going to stand in line for that, and some people don't want anything to do with it. But your larger point is exactly right, and that's the most common misconception that I encounter about Scotch whiskey. They hear the word, folks hear the word Scotch, and they think it's going to be peaty, and they think it's going to be real rough. And those are the two most common misconceptions. And I call me biased. I suppose I am. I think the ones we're going to enjoy together this evening belie both of those ideas. They are very pretty. They are very soft, and there isn't a hint of peat in any of them. In fact, we don't use any peat in any part of our production process at the Dalmore. You having a peaty whiskey at this point in the industry, in this era, is a choice that you can make if you want to have those sort of flavors in your whiskeys. And if you don't want to have them, you need to use peat in the drying of the malt.
So, I think this is time for the map portion. Without a map, that people will just listen to this. So there's a variety of regions of Scotland. If you could quickly name them and then share where the Dalmore is. Sure.
So, the Scotch Whisky Authority has identified a number of different whiskey producing regions in Scotland that can be loosely grouped together for some commonality of maybe elevation, similarity in water source, and grain. If you go back far enough, whatever the farmers were doing locally, and probably more important now, establish local tradition. If I always thought that a whiskey from the lowlands would taste a particular way, that's probably going to drive the style that's produced even now, even if you could buck that tradition now with modern techniques. But to answer your question, we've got the biggest region by far, spanning a huge portion of Scotland and down into the islands, a region that we call the Highlands, the biggest whiskey producing region by far. It's a massive area. Hard to typify these whiskeys. I mean, they some of them have a whisper of peat. Some of them, once you get down to the islands, can be quite medicinal. But they tend to have backbone. They tend to be, bigger whiskeys, whiskeys with something to say. Within the Highlands, in the northeast, along the famous River Spey, there popped up so many distilleries that became so famous and drove so much excitement that that area that became known as Speyside ultimately got its own designation. So it sits within the Highlands, but it's its own separate designation in the Highlands called Speyside. And right there in that quite small, geographically speaking, area, you'll find, at one point, over half of Scotland's operating malt whiskey distilleries were right there in Speyside, and a lot of the most famous ones that you can think of, Glenlivet, Glenfiddich, the Macallan, Balvenie, Aberlour, on and on and on. There are so many grouped right around there, and these tend to be soft honeyed malts. You don't really use peat typically or sea peat in a Speyside whiskey, and they are they're lovely drams for sure, and you can see why they have become so popular. The lowlands of Scotland, an area that in the boom and bust cycle of the whiskey industry has suffered some closures in recent past. Though not as nearly as many producing distilleries there as there once were. You're going to find lighter, grassy, floral malts. Again, I'm speaking generally. You could also plant the flag as a distiller and make something in any of these regions and go, I'm going to do something completely different than what's typically seen here. And you can do it by bringing in, a malt from a different area and changing your techniques. But so you have the lowlands. Then you've got the Whiskey Island off the west coast, where most of the big, powerful, punchy, peaty guys are made. This of course is the island of Islay, which is become a bit of a mecca for a peated whiskey fan. If that's your style, you're probably going to have a trip to Islay on your bucket list. And then you have a little peninsula called Campbelltown, which about over 100 years ago was the seat of Scotch whiskey production. There were more malt distilleries in Campbelltown there than anywhere else, and a lot of very, very highly regarded single malts. But again, due to the vagaries of the boom and bust cycle of the industry, they sort of expanded too much, put out too much whiskey, and then really suffered when tastes changed. A lot of distilleries closed, and these days there are only a handful of distilleries in Campbelltown, and probably the most famous is Springbank, which we talked about earlier. And let's see what we got. We got Islay, Highlands, Lowlands, Speyside, Campbelltown. That's it. Those are the five. And within that, the Dalmore, nearest and dearest to my heart, sits way up in the northern Highlands, about 20 miles north of the city of Inverness. So we're well north, quite a drive from Speyside. Although, as we'll discover together, stylistically, I think there's a lot in common with what you would think of as a traditional Speyside whiskey. The softness, the approachability, the warmth, the honeyed notes, the rich chocolate. All of those things to me would suggest I might be found along the River Spey. But indeed, I'm in a bit more hospitable climes further north, right on the banks of a big estuary called the Cromarty Firth that feeds out into the North Sea. That's where you'll find the Dalmore.
And that concludes our Scotch geography lesson. And so thanks for coming, and you can close your textbooks now. But no, we
I think it's helpful.
We appreciate
because
that.
a lot of people think Islay is what Scotch is. And that's just the overwhelming bias of, I guess, how strong their freaking whiskey is.
Right.
How powerful that whiskey, those flavor notes are.
Yeah. Well, you try a Lafroy, you're not likely to forget it. So I can understand why that make an impression. Yeah.
But no, I mean, I don't think I think it's a nuance that people just need to understand. And like, I just love the just understanding, because in America we haven't become that sophisticated in our whiskey production. Everything's the majority of it comes from Kentucky, right?
Right.
Bourbon, it doesn't make sense. But as Texas and Washington State and New York and some of these other states start to really crank out whiskey production, you're going to see some regionality start to form, and it's going to be like your heritage bluegrass Kentucky stuff, and then Texas bourbon is completely different than Kentucky bourbon. There's no two ways around it.
Yep.
And so I think it's cool to see how that happens and some of the geographical preferences that happen in the states as we mature.
That is fascinating. I believe it or not, I've never thought about that, but you're absolutely right. That's where this will head, and you will start to have some regional designations happen in the U.S. as well. Of course, you will. That's really cool. Yeah.
And then even within that, you'll have the outliers or the people that do things a little bit different. You might have a Texas whiskey that's totally not like any other Texas whiskey, and that's totally fine. But generally speaking, when you're trying to teach somebody about whiskey, an overwhelming subject, it is helpful to have that, those regional characteristics.
It's a good place to start for sure. Yeah.
And so, now that we know where the Dalmore sits, I think we need to figure out where the Dalmore goes into our mouth and down to our stomachs, right? I think that's going to get everyone excited.
I like you as a host because you egg on the whiskey drinking.
I was starting to worry a little bit, gents. I'll be honest. Like, I don't normally speak for this long without having a dram in front of me. So let's absolutely get to our first pour of this evening. And while we do that, I'll tell you a little bit about it. I would love to start, if you guys are amenable to it, with a little taste of our flagship bottling of the Dalmore, and that is, of course, the 12-year-old. So just like in bourbon whiskey, anytime you see an age statement on a bottle, that is your indication and your guarantee the youngest drop of liquid in that bottle spent at least that long in oak casks. So this is going to really capture the DNA of the Dalmore, our house character. This is where it all starts. We bottled nothing younger than this, so we're going to need 12 years at a minimum just to bring you a whiskey from the Dalmore distillery. As you get your nose in this, let me just tell you that the name Dalmore means big field, big meadowland in Scotch Gaelic, which is exactly what the landscape still looks like if you ever get a chance to come up and see us. In fact, the distillery was established on an operating farm, and that is very much the vibe up and around the distillery. A lot of farmland, a lot of soft green rolling hills, and the whiskey that we're producing is also quite soft. It's very subtle, and it takes its primary characteristics from a really specialized program of cask curation. We at the Dalmore have some really special relationships with wineries and bodegas around the world that ensure us ongoing access to casks that aren't seen anywhere else in the industry. Most importantly for us, and you will see it here in the 12-year, we have exclusive access to casks that were first used to make a 30-year-old Oloroso sherry called Methuselah. That sherry is produced by Gonzalez Byass. They make Tio Pepe, which you might see at your in the fortified wine section of your local wine and spirit store. Methuselah's a little harder to find than that because it's going to take 30 years at a minimum to make the wine, and then we get those casks. And so across the range of Dalmore, what you're experiencing here and what I'm about to take you through owes a lot of its structure, a lot of its foundation to the notes that we'll pull from this gorgeous 30-year-old sherry that's left soaked through the staves by the time we get those casks. So our new make spirit starts in first fill bourbon barrels, and then we'll finesse some of those aging stocks in these one-of-a-kind sherry casks. So to me, initially, there's a little dark chocolate. There's a distinctive orange peel or orange zest. And then on the palate, it's very creamy. It's very mouth coating. want to chew on it for a little while, and the chocolate orange notes will come back again, and then maybe a little bit of fresh ground coffee on the palate. At least those are the primary notes for me. Let me know what you guys think.
Yeah, so I recently put up a review on bourbonlens.com, and I'm getting a little bit something different tonight, and that's probably because of what I've eaten today. And I think that's what's beautiful about whiskey is every time you pour a dram, your experience could be a little bit different depending on what you had, how clean your palate is, yada, yada, yada. You know, when I wrote the review, I got a lot of soft vanilla, plum, cherry. It was like those rich, dark stone fruit type notes. Today I'm getting a lot of caramel on the nose, which is really sweet, which is really nice. And I get a lot of the orchard fruit, like Honeycrisp apple, and then you get that nuttiness and the oakiness of being in those really Oloroso casks. And then, you know, on the nose, like at the very back end, I'm getting that plum, cherry, those notes I expect from Oloroso, like getting to show back up on the back end. So I don't get the orange zest for me, but that's the great thing about whiskey is we can sit across the table and we could have completely different tasting notes, and that's what makes whiskey fun. It's subjective. It's not objective.
Oh, certainly. We are entirely in the realm of the subjective at this point. The only thing that I hope we can all take away on this is that it's pretty damn good. It's a great way to kick off my evening, and I hope you guys feel the same.
So you had a tasting note, and you said fresh ground coffee beans.
Yeah,
and I was trying to figure out, because I've got some notes here that it's basically like cherry, and then I said cherry wood shavings, like fresh cut cherry wood. Then I was thinking back in my mental Rolodex, and there's this coffee that I love, and I you know, it's one of my favorites of all time, but it's called Tanzanian peaberry, and it's a very tiny coffee bean. When you grind that up, it just pops with like this cherry. Like fruit, like it doesn't even smell like coffee at that point, but it's just so fresh, and that's kind of what hit me. And then you said, you know, coffee beans, and I was like, oh, but I definitely get that orange note as well. Which going back to this Tanzanian peaberry, and this is my coffee geekdom, I guess you could say, but it's from Tanzania, which in, you know, that region of coffee, I typically get a huge pop of citrus. So that's kind of where I'm at on this one. It reminds me a hell of a lot of those notes that I get from that coffee, which is just crazy. So yeah, you do get that light, like vanilla, but then you also get the kind of those coffee notes as well.
I love that. I'm fascinated by that. You're gonna have to send me a link to purchase some of that coffee. But precisely when you have a really beautiful like single origin bean that's just been freshly ground, and all of those fantastic fruit forward aromas can come out. It's not as simple as just, well, there's a little bit of like coffee bitterness and we're done. You know, any coffee nerd listening will have a heart attack to even hear that, right? They can be as complex as a bouquet from Bordeaux. So yeah, I agree with you. Although I don't get that on the nose as much. It's really on the palate for me that I get near the finish that I get more of that espresso note, or single origin coffee note. It's interesting that both of you identify so strongly with cherry, which is something that I really don't find in these, but I find in a lot of bourbons. And I just think it's interesting, not right or wrong, just since you guys do drink a lot of American whiskeys and a lot of bourbons, if that's a note that you're used to kind of ferreting out, or it's just, you know, simply down to the differences in palate. But
no, I mean, I think it's very common. Like if you listen to any of our episodes, one of us will pick out a cherry note in just about every other whiskey we drink, I feel like. And I think it has to do with like getting real meticulous about the yeast strains, because that's where you're getting a lot of it. especially any Buffalo Trace product is going to be, red cherry. Scott picks it out every time. It's like, it's amazing. Like we do a blind and there's anything with Sazerac in it and Scott pegs it. And I'm like, this is bullshit. Almost like how you got 100 on the, Bourbon Stewart and I got a 96, but there's just like things like that, that really kind of like, show up, and it's more yeast than it is actually the whiskey itself.
Fascinating. Yeah. Really cool.
I think also when we're talking about cherry too, it could be a particular type of cherry, because I think cherry is not just one note, right? Red grapes. Okay. That tastes like red grapes, but cherry could be candied cherry. It could be,
right. Is it stewed?
A fresh Bing cherry.
Is it in a jam? Is it in a pie? Yeah,
exactly.
Right.
Exactly. It runs the gamut. So maybe for me, when I say cherry, I'm identifying a fruit, and maybe when I'm trying to narrow that down into something else, I could be more descriptive. But yeah.
It's not cherry Pop-Tart for me. It's like a little bit of like cherry juice, it's
brighter, it's fresher.
It's bright, yeah. And it's like I get a lot of characteristics of an old fashioned in this in general, like from a flavor profile perspective, that I think would lend really well if you wanted to switch up your drink, your spirit of choice. I think this would hold up really well in an old fashioned, from a cocktail perspective. And you could probably leave out a little bit of the simple because it's got that sweetness in it, because the flavors would really, really go well together.
Well, if I was the test giver, I would have just upgraded your score to at least a 98 for that. That's absolutely true. I love an old fashioned with a Dalmore 12. The only change I would suggest to the classic recipe is to switch out your Angostura bitters for some chocolate mole bitters. The Ango and the Dalmore fight a little bit, but to reinforce the chocolate note and the spice with chocolate bitters is just fantastic. That's one of my favorite ways to serve the Dalmore, especially if I'm talking to somebody who, would rather enjoy a whiskey cocktail than a whiskey neat. That's a go-to.
Who makes your favorite chocolate bitters?
If you can find it, I like the Scrappy's
Yes.
chocolate bitters.
Yeah.
I like those because they don't bring the mole spice into it, which is delicious, but can sort of overcomplicate what I'm trying to do with this, where I really just want the flavors of the Dalmore to shine through. But Scrappy's can be hard to find. And chocolate mole from Bitterman's, or gosh, I think a number of reputable bitters companies do a chocolate mole these days, and those will work as well.
So, just while we're here, before we get into our next pour, which is the Dalmore 14, what is the cocktail scene in the single malt, area? Like, it's become huge in the States, right? Rye whiskey has, and Bullet in particular, has kind of taken that over. And you're seeing a huge movement just in cocktails in general. Like, what is the cocktail scene, from a single malt perspective? Because that's one thing, like, because of the delicate flavors standing up, the balances, I think, have to be a little bit more dialed in. You can't just use your 1-for-1s. I think your vermouth could kill something if you're doing like a Manhattan. And the same thing goes for an old fashioned. You use the wrong type of bitters. You use too much simple. You're going to drown your cocktail. So what is the cocktail scene like?
Well, that's such a good question. I think traditionally, real single malt purists would have to go and find their fainting couch whenever someone talked about, using them to make cocktails, which I think is just a shame, because there's so much energy and innovation and creativity happening right now on the mixology scene that why would you just self-select out of that? It doesn't make any sense. I want my whiskey, and as a fan of single malts, I want single malts to be put to good use by artisans at the bar, and I love a great Scotch whiskey cocktail. Now, there are some very traditional Scotch whiskey drinks that are perennial favorites of mine and people who are in the industry. The Blood and Sand, of course, a Manhattan made with a blended Scotch, or a single malt is a Rob Roy. I'm a big fan of a Bobby Burns, a riff on that with a little bar spoon of Benedictine instead of the bitters. There and many others that I'm a Godfather, right? That's a pretty simple one. A Rusty Nail. There's a lot, but I'm probably not going to, in all honesty, rock up to a bar and order a Rusty Nail these days. In the classic version, they put way too much Drambuie in there anyway. It's super sweet. But to be honest, the cocktail scene, in my estimation, is still pretty owned by gin, by increasingly mezcal or agave spirits, including tequila and mezcal, and of course vodka. Although whiskey cocktails have certainly come on the scene in recent past, I think it's all about making sure that I think this is true. Whatever you want to drink, know where you're at, right? If you're just down at your local pub, where it's all about striking up a chat with the bartender and hanging out for a bit, I'm gonna have a whiskey neat or have a beer. I'm not gonna ask that guy to make me a Vieux Carré. But if I'm at Death and Co, not only do I want to maybe order something on the menu that's got a Scotch whiskey base, I might even go off menu and say, listen, what would you love to make right now that's stirred and spirit forward and features this whiskey? But it's a small part of our business still. I mean, it's probably as representing the Dalmore specifically, it's the entire on-premise category, bars and restaurants. It's probably 5% of my business right now, and I would like that. I would like that to be bigger, but that's not atypical for single malt. These are expensive products that people typically look to enjoy, at home or in moments of celebration or give as gifts. Not many people are as dedicated as I am and are going to order a single malt while they're out to dinner every night of the week, no matter what the occasion.
Amen to that. So, I just find it fascinating right now because I feel like cocktails are the thing. And, you talked about like the complexity and the expensiveness, right? You have to spend a lot of time, effort importing barrels, obviously from the States is not cheap.
Yeah.
Getting the secondary finished casks. So that leads us into, hey, you're aging for a little bit longer. Now we have this 14 year. If the 12 year is your traditional, and I believe the 14 is kind of replacing the 15 from like all the things I've kind of read and looked into, is like the one you might be pushing a little bit more than the 15. What should we expect from this whiskey that's, the youngest being 14 years old versus the 12.
I'm really glad you mentioned that because it gives me an opportunity to correct that rumor, because we are not retiring the 15 year. The Dalmore 15 year is a lot of people's all-time favorite expression of this whiskey. So I'm here to reassure all of those folks that we have no intention to stop producing the Dalmore 15-year-old. However, it is true, and maybe this is some of the reason for the rumor, that the Dalmore is the fastest growing single malt by value, both in the United States and globally. Every drop that we're producing is highly allocated at this point, and it takes us 15 years to make a 15-year-old and 18 years to make an 18-year-old and so on. So it's a tough business model, which hopefully is an indicator to everybody that the United States is a critical market for us to really build a passionate base of fans, because the 14 year is a U.S. exclusive. This is the only place in the world where you're going to be able to try this whiskey. So any friends visiting from other ports of call, make sure they go home with one of these because they won't find it anywhere else. It's also the first time that we've ever used any Pedro Ximénez sherry casks, PX sherry. We've always had a long and enduring love affair with Oloroso sherry, but we've never really done much beyond admiring from afar or flirting with PX. So this new U.S. exclusive, using lovely stocks that are finessed in some rich Pedro Ximénez sherry casks from our partners at Gonzalez Byass, gives us a whole new way to experience the Dalmore. This was just launched in September. So it is brand new. I mean, it is not a limited release. It's an ongoing extension of our Principal Collection. And I think it's really fantastic. So if the classic notes on the 12 are that chocolate orange, that bright cherry note, if I'm putting myself in your shoes a little bit, for this one, for me anyway, there's immediately like just layers of honeyed dates, maybe a little bit of allspice. The citrus, the orange peel is back. I mean, for me, the orange citrus is a giveaway that I've got some sherry cask influence. I think that's why I always find it. This one's also a little higher ABV than the 12 or the 15. This is at 43%, and it's going to give you a little bit more weight on the mouthfeel. It's 43.8 to be precise. So ticking almost up to 44. So after you've discovered that honey date and allspice note, see what you think on the palate. I think there's lots of blackberries, but like sugared blackberries, pralines, like a sugared cookie kind of vibe, a little cream caramel. Anyway, I'm gonna have a sip.
Yeah, I think as you take a sip, the thing that got me was like it's jammy, right? Like so, it's like you can almost smell the consistency that you're going to get. And I get that a lot with PX just in general, because it does give that jammy consistency smell. And it's like a blackberry. It's not a grape or a strawberry. It's definitely, it leans towards that. And there's like that little hint of like chocolate, like it's almost mocha, like you're at a coffee shop and somebody orders a mocha. Like that's kind of the chocolatey blackberry jam thing that I'm kind of getting. That's kind of overpowering.
I love it. As soon as you said that, I discovered it, and I haven't ever found that note before, but that's absolutely right. A little bit of a mocha note on the palate. So as you guys continue to enjoy this, let me tell you a little bit about how we produced it. I might have mentioned before, but just to clarify, every drop of our new make spirit at the Dalmore first goes into bourbon barrels for the initial stage of the maturation, and not just any bourbon barrels. We insist on first fill bourbon barrels at our distillery, meaning it's the first time those barrels have been used in the Scotch whiskey industry. So they were dumped after producing a bourbon and then make their way to us at the Dalmore. We're going to get the most extraction of flavor and character from that first filled barrel. So we'll build the foundation. In the case of the 12-year, after approximately 9 years, a portion of the aging stocks will be moved into the Oloroso sherry casks. Some of those casks will be those exquisite 30-year-old sherry, and the remainder stay in bourbon, and then we'll bring it back together. So it's not a full finish. It's maybe 40 to 60% of the batch. In the case of the 14-year, similar principle. After 12 years in bourbon, a significant portion of the stocks will be put into PX casks that were first used to make about an 8-year-old PX sherry from Gonzalez Byass. The remainder stay in bourbon, and then we'll bring those two back together to create this assemblage that is going to give you this sweeter, richer, even more dessert style whiskey than we're known for, and we already make, I think, a rather dessert like style as is. So I really love this, and the initial feedback to it has been really strong from people.
Yeah, I think that like you said, the orange does carry over. You can tell that it's in the same family. Mm-hmm. But what I get for this is kind of a more like nutty characteristic, like a richness that just kind of elevates those lighter, fruitier notes that is in the 12.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I can't disagree with you there either. I mean, all kinds of sherry, nutty characteristics in all of these. Absolutely.
Yeah, and on the palate, like the chocolate, I think is more present, or that mocha is more present there. And it's, and I don't drink coffee at all, but like I've been in my fair share of coffee shops picking up coffee for people. Uh-huh. It's like when the cream hits the mocha, like in the chocolate syrup, like that's the kind of the flavor note that I'm getting there on my palate. But then it fades to like this really This reminds me of the signatory that kind of like made me fall in love with wanting to try the Dalmore. Is like there's like an apricot kind of note that shows up that kind of falls off from the chocolate, and that I think is. I just really want to get a piece of like bundt cake and just like have cream cheese icing and have this just on the side and just slowly enjoy that as my dessert and watching my hips gain about 10 pounds.
Well, that's where it'll go, my friend.
Yes.
I love that.
For sure.
You reminded me of a tasting that I did just a couple weeks ago for Thanksgiving, where we paired some expressions of the Dalmore with 3 different classic Thanksgiving pies. And we paired the 14-year with an apple crumble with some vanilla ice cream a la mode, and it was extraordinary. I even poured a little bit of the 14 over the ice cream at one point to experience it in a different way, delightful. So I hear
Scott. He's a man after my own heart with what he just said.
Start talking about food. Jake wakes up.
Yes, it's the whiskey plus the food that really gets me excited.
Pairings are fun for sure.
This one kind of finishes with like a bitter tea note, and I'm thinking it's kind of more like Earl Grey or like almost like a licorice type note that it's just kind of lingers after all the other flavors kind of just subside.
I'm with you on the tea. Maybe a little bergamot as well. But keep that idea about the licorice in your back pocket, because I want to come back to that in a couple of whiskeys.
Okay,
Scott, you're ahead. That's why you got 100 on test, man. I'm gonna not let him live that down.
I'm up on the scorecard, right?
Yep, you are. You're winning. And so it's really interesting, just the difference in just like a little bit of the finishing barrel, like how that can just change the complexity in the mouthfeel. Because I think this one's just a little bit richer on the mouthfeel.
I think so.
Where the other ones is creamier.
Yeah.
It's like really creamy. This is like, it's rich and it's like having that dessert jammy kind of consistency.
Yeah. I think, well, there's good reason for that. You've got so much residual sugar in a Pedro Ximénez sherry. It's a true dessert wine. It pours out of the bottle like maple syrup. That's the consistency of PX. So you're gonna have the influence of all of that residual sugar in the PX cask that the whiskey will take on during maturation, and that's lending to that fantastic velvety mouth feel, the way it's sitting on your palate, and giving it a little bit more of that, I don't know, luxurious feeling.
So you said that this is an American exclusive. Is it targeting the American whiskey drinker?
That's a good question. I can't say that I was in the room when they landed on this idea for this American exclusive. I can tell you that we were asking for something that would be exclusive to the U.S. market that we could really get behind, and we wanted something different. Dalmore is traditionally thought of as a sherried whiskey, and that's a style that appeals to Americans, but honestly, it's a style that appeals to whiskey drinkers around the world. But we wanted to be able to hang our hat on something a little bit different. So here was a way for us to still be true to that classic Dalmore style, that 1-2 punch, if you will, of bourbon and lovely sherry. But here's a style of sherry that we've not typically used. And that's where we landed. But you could make the argument that we might have more deliberately been fishing for the U.S. whiskey drinker if we had aged it exclusively in the bourbon barrel. But and I've tried those expressions of we've done that in the past, and they are fantastic. They need a little bit of age on them, in my opinion. But there are some expressions of Constellation and some other one-offs that we've done over the years that are quite old and were only ever in the bourbon barrel, and those can be great. But to me, when I think of Dalmore, I'm always thinking about the multi-stage maturation that uses some sort of wine cask, probably something from southern Spain, but maybe something from port, maybe something from Bordeaux. so I'm glad that we stayed with that style, because to me that's the sweet spot. That's the style of Dalmore that I want to curl up on the couch with.
Yeah, because I noticed. I mean, obviously the proof is a little bit higher. It's almost 7.5 points higher. So it's like you're creeping into that. All right, American whiskey. We just talked about it.
Yeah,
we like our higher proof whiskeys. Not that this is a high proof spirit, but it's like,
no,
this is speaking to the American whiskey drinker, in my opinion, with kind of those nuttier notes that that sit on top of like those lighter, delicate fruit flavors.
I'm glad you think so, and I hope people love it. If you guys listening haven't tried it yet, and if this sounds interesting at all to you, I hope you find your way to a store that carries some. It's not an expensive dram to grab, and let me know what you think. I hope you love them.
Yeah. $90.99 on reservebar.com.
Yeah.
I'm on the website. I'm doing a little research on our next whiskey that we're about to drink. So I was just, got the price here for you. Get it right to your doorstep.
That's it. Yeah. But speaking of, creeping up into a higher ABV and offering something that might be more in the wheelhouse of somebody who likes higher proof whiskeys, that makes me think immediately of the Portwood Reserve, which is the next one I wanted to show to you guys.
Yeah. And so, I was looking like, a lot of times in the States, right, we talk about finishing whiskeys, right? And so that's in essence, almost all Scotch single malts are finished in some way, shape, or form, right? They go into some type of sherry butt or additional cask whatsoever that they choose. So like, what's making this one uniquely different from what we just tasted with the PX? Like, if I'm reading correct, it looks like it's
Correct.
Tawny Port.
It is Tawny Port, and I might just add a little bit more context to what you just said about what we usually do in Scotland. I think it's important to recognize that while you certainly think of sherry casks when you think of Scotch whiskey, because they are historically a big part of how they make whiskey in Scotland, and a component of a lot of the most famous styles. As we sit here now, most Scotch whiskey is aged in bourbon barrels. That's by far the most common vessel that's used in the industry. And even when you're going to bring other flavors into it, what's more common than a finish is to fill some bourbon barrels, some sherry butts, some hogsheads, and some refill casks, and then look after all of those for the entirety of the maturation, and then marry it together to create the style that you're looking for. So it's not necessarily the most common thing to finish in a sherry cask, although certainly a lot of the most popular distilleries in Scotland employ that method for sure.
Yeah.
So anyway, just wanted to mention that. But yeah, so the Portwood Reserve, this is the one that I would probably get out first if we met at a bar and you guys are like, listen, man, if it's not bottled in bond, I'm not even getting out of bed. Like, okay, well, I can't quite get the 50%, but I can get the 46.5 and non-chill filtered with this gentle giant here. Biggest whiskey in the family for the Dalmore, but it doesn't present that way. It's so soft. You'd be forgiven if you forget that it's 46.5. This is one of the only ones that I typically like to add a little water to. I will drink most of the other whiskeys in front of us neat, but I will add a little water to this. And the Tawny Port is worthy of note because port pipes, port casks in general are seen less often than sherry casks. So already we're talking about, something that's a little more specialized. But when you do see port pipes in Scotch whiskey, it tends to be ruby port. So even less common to see a Tawny Port. The Tawny Port is a style of port that spends more time in oak, giving it the tawny color and more of that sort of nuttiness. And the casks, consequently, give us a really interesting vessel for finishing the whiskey because the port was in there for a longer time than you'd have with a ruby port cask. So more layers of flavor, a little more, I think, subtlety for us to work with here. And what the end result is just going to come right through with that ripe plum note for me anyway. There's ripe plum, there's toffee, cream caramel, that like someone's just like zesting an orange right over the glass. Definitely some almond notes, some hazelnut, but it's that ripe plum note that's right up front that will set this one apart from all the other expressions from the Dalmore.
Yeah, so this reminds me of Angel's Envy did the Cellar Collection Tawny Port. So they did their oldest bourbon release and I think they were like 10 to 12-year-old bourbon casks in Tawny Port, and I loved it. And a lot of those characteristics are shining through. There's a little bit of obviously oakiness and nuttiness, almonds, hazelnut, something in that family, kind of a more bland, not like a cashew or anything. But then like that plum, that rich, like, and people hate it, but stone fruit type note, like that's what's shining through. So really nicely. But then like there's like a syrupy consistency to the mouthfeel, and chocolate and oak and like vanilla kind of swirl on your palate. And then that plum kind of sits there at the very end to me, on the back half, where that dark fruit tends to show up. So it's just a really nice commingling of flavors, from start to finish.
That's fantastic. Chocolate and oak, by the way, is the title of my upcoming memoir.
There we go.
Yeah. I've been considering a few different things, but I think that one you just named it for me.
It's just like the depth and complexity of the casks you can smell and you can taste it.
Right.
Like, I love when there's time and passion put in behind the casks itself.
Yeah.
That it shows up in the whiskey. Sometimes
it's such an important point of the process. It is the single most important decision that we'll make at the distillery. What type of cask to use and how long to put the whiskey in there. Nothing else comes remotely close to influencing what's ultimately in your glass. So again, that's why my favorite thing to tell people about the Dalmore is we maintain exclusivity to these really rare sherry casks, like the 30-year-old Methuselah Oloroso. In this case, 10-year-old Tawny Port from Graham's. So we're sourcing these directly from Graham's Port. If you've tried Graham's 10-year Tawny Port or seen it on a menu or at a store, it's those casks and no others that we're using here in the last 2 to 3 years, depending on the batch, to influence the Portwood Reserve.
This one surprised me. From the nose to the palate, I feel like it's just the waves of flavor that you get on the palate. I didn't expect from the nose. Like after nosing it, like, okay, it's light, delicate, fruity, like the others that we've had. But then I taste it and I'm just like, boom, hit with a punch of oak, dark raisins, caramel, the caramel toffee.
Roasted nuts.
Yeah. Just like dark, rich, it's just, I mean, it just surprised me. I don't know any other way to put it, but sometimes whiskeys, when you nose them, you're like, I know exactly what to expect. I know exactly what it's going to taste like.
Right.
This one, you could say, oh, it's two different whiskeys based upon the nose and the palate. My tasting notes, just very interesting.
There are layers to discover here, and I really appreciate you guys taking this much time with these because they are soft. They are quieter whiskeys in the spectrum when you're comparing to a lot of traditional bourbons, as we've been talking about, and that means they can be easy to knock back or not pay a whole lot of attention to. Well, that was smooth, that was nice. On to the next thing. But if you sit and take your time with these, and certainly with something like the Portwood Reserve, there are layers of complexity to discover here. So your time spent will be rewarded, I think. And dollar for flavor, if I can create that comparison, there's tremendous value to be had in the Portwood Reserve. This is another whiskey of ours that in a lot of places is going to sit right at 99 or maybe just over, and that's a whole lot of flavor and a whole lot of time well spent with a whiskey glass for that price.
So did I miss it? What is there an age statement on this one?
You didn't miss it. We've elected not to put an age statement on this one. This is about selecting the whiskeys that are exactly the right character for what we're looking to create with the Portwood Reserve. So it's a whiskey created for character as opposed to a date on the calendar, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing I can tell you with 100% transparency and confidence, the 12 year that we started our tasting with is the youngest thing that we're ever going to put in a bottle. The Dalmore is a very big, robust, muscular new make spirit that needs to be settled down in oak for a decade and a couple years for good measure. So, we're going to see a range of whiskeys, but it's really about selecting that tawny port pipe to bring this one to the next level and bottling it at a higher ABV that's made it a fan of whiskey drinkers.
Yeah. I mean, while people probably are like, oh, hey, man, the 18 is what I always want to try to grab for because that's like the premium one that's available on shelves most often. If you're a bourbon drinker, man, like it'd be hard to pass that one up. And like my rule of thumb, it doesn't always hold true to Scotch single malts, but like $10 for a year, like if you can get that at a price point, man, like you're doing pretty good. Luckily, single malts, you can get the 12-year expressions in just about any of them for about $60 to $70. So you're getting dollar cost average a lot better than you are for bourbons. But like, I think that's what's supremely unique about, those expressions that you all have. And this one, for a bourbon drinker, you're going to spend $100 on a no-name brand in a heartbeat just because you heard some pub about it on social media. Why not try something that's been around for 200 plus years and getting consistent flavors?
Yeah, give it a day in court. See what you think. And that's all we're asking. Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And you reminded me when your $10 per year calculation reminded me, it wasn't that long ago in the scheme of things, or maybe I'm just that old, when some bars would price their single malts basically at an equation that worked out to a dollar a year. So you have an 18-year-old single malt, that's $18. A 25-year-old single malt, it's $25. I was driving cross country from New York to Los Angeles to relocate out here about 7 years ago, and stopped over somewhere in the Southwest and found myself in a little bar not far from the hotel for the night, where they were pricing things that way, and I found a bottle of a 25-year-old single malt from one of my favorite distilleries, and it was $25 for a glass, and would have been a lot more than that anywhere else you would have found it. So I had a few of those, and money well spent.
The hidden gems.
Yeah.
Oh, that's what's great about traveling across America is finding those things and finding the whiskey that really just makes you just happy. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like, cause that's what it is. It's about the experience, and being able to tell that story. But now we're getting into what I would say is the grand poobah from just the normal lineup, right? Yeah. You do have the 25-year, which is a huge step up in price.
Yes.
This is around $350. The 25-year, I believe, is like $1,800. And is there anything in between besides maybe some special limited releases?
There is, Jake. Glad you asked me that. The other new whiskey this year, aside from the 14-year, is a lovely limited release 21-year-old Dalmore. This is going to come out in limited quantities on an annual basis, and it sits there at a nice kind of relief point between the big jump that you just mentioned that we take from the 18 to the 25. Suggested retail price on the 21 this year was $7.99, which is still very much a special occasion bottle. I'm aware, but not nearly as pricey as getting a bottle of the 25-year these days. So the 21 is lovely stuff. If you can grab hold of it. We only got 1,000 bottles into the United States of this year's release, and almost equally hard to find these days. The Dalmore 18-year, which is just an exquisite whiskey, one of my all-time favorite malts. So glad to share it with you gentlemen here, and it's one that really encapsulates everything that we're about. Taking our time with the whiskey, selecting only the most pinnacle casks, showcasing our relationships with bodegas in Jerez, that yield us these sherry casks that you won't find anywhere else, and bringing to life the real elegance and charm of the Dalmore. One thing I love about the 18 is that when I put my nose in this, if I close my eyes and kind of let my mind drift, I can find myself transported to one of our dunnage warehouses back at the distillery. You can smell the dirt floor. You can smell the old wood staves and the salt of the sea from the nearby Cromarty Firth. And then as you're continuing to nose, some of the more traditional Dalmore notes will make themselves apparent. The fig, the dark chocolate, the cinnamon notes and baking spices are there. This is your quintessential steakhouse whiskey, right? This is the one you want to order after you've closed the menu and asked for that, grass-fed ribeye. So this is the 14. I mean, this is the 18. I started to say 14 because it's 14 years in bourbon barrels, and then every last drop of this is exclusively finished in the 30-year-old Methuselah sherry, bottled at 43% alcohol by volume, 86 proof. And if you don't like this one, I don't have any other tricks up my sleeve for you.
Well, so I'd say the note that you hit that I had right on the bat was the salinity.
Mm-hmm.
There's that salinity is definitely there. Kind of made my nose tingle a little bit, like, because you can, as you shared your story, I could put myself in front of an ocean,
mm-hmm.
right from a distance,
mm-hmm.
not right up on it. It's when you first smell the ocean
right.
as you're driving up to the beach, and you're in your car, your windows are barely cracked, maybe not even cracked at all, and you start
right.
to smell that. No, but the dark fig date, whatever is just beautiful, and the oak complexity is nice. And a lot of people are like, oh, you said there's oak. Well, yeah, it's an 18-year-old dram, duh. But like, no, there's harsh oak and then there's delicate oak.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is a really nice soft oak that mingles. Again, I'm using that word a lot tonight, but like mingles well with the flavor profile, because the tannins are what you're looking for from that oak, and you can smell the tannins that you're about
for
to
sure.
drink.
There's no way around it when you're taking 20 years to make something. It's this whiskey's been in barrels for a minimum of 18. Some of it's 19, some of it's 20, some of it's old enough to order itself, down at the local bar later after this. So this on balance, 2 decades to end up in the glass, gentlemen. And Scott, I wanted to come back to you'd said earlier about a black licorice note. To me, one of the giveaways that I'm encountering in an older Dalmore it's really had some time behind it is a little bit of licorice stick of black licorice on the palate near the finish, and maybe even starting to drift into like an aged balsamic note, which I'll start to really get on the 25 and older. But that licorice note, certainly here at the 18.
Okay.
Aged balsamic. That's a very interesting term, but like, I get what you're saying. There's like a little vinegary finish to it. That
almost like makes you pop your gums. Like
your salivary glands kind of go,
yeah. I also get kind of like a stout cask finish. Like it's got like a chocolatey stout, like literally my first tasting note was stout beer.
Stout beer. I love it. This is really cool. I'm going to steal some of these tasting notes you guys have given me tonight.
But yeah,
do I need to
like,
credit you when I do that?
No, not at all. But okay. I literally knew nothing about these 4 whiskeys going in. I mean, look at the bottles that Jake sent me. He's got Dalmore on every one of them, and then he's got a number like 14 or 12 or 18, and then he's got the proof. That's all I knew about these.
That's all you knew. Yeah.
Obviously, I knew the 18 was probably going to be the best one of the bunch, but it's just so interesting because I had no idea that it was a majority bourbon cask and then sherry cask to finish. No clue, but it totally makes sense. But this one, if I didn't say it before, the portwood obviously was very super rich and just delicious. This one is like deep, dark whiskey. I mean, there's no other way to put it.
Yeah, this is a real special occasion dram. There's no way around that. And if life has been so kind to you that you can have a special occasion dram 7 days a week, fantastic.
Yeah.
But for me, it always, whether I'm at a good friend's wedding or on a Monday evening talking whiskey with a couple of great chaps via Zoom, it elevates the moment. It elevates the occasion.
Yeah.
I would probably be remiss in my capacity as head of advocacy for the Dalmore if I didn't tell you guys the story behind the stag, which is something I would love to do before we sign off.
Absolutely.
So while it may have taken us 18 years to make the Dalmore 18, the distillery has a royal heritage that is a bit older than that. Indeed, it stretches back to the year 1263. In that year, King of Scotland at the time, King Alexander III, was out hunting with his lords in attendance when he was set upon by and surprised by a big 12-point stag, what the Scots called a royal stag, because up until this point in time, the symbol of the 12-point stag with 12 points on his rack was the exclusive right of the king to use. It meant royalty. It meant the king. Anyway, this particular dude charged at the king, probably because he was spooked. Who knows? And some accounts say he was thrown from his saddle. But at the last moment, Colin Kintail, chief of the Clan Mackenzie, stepped forward, felled the stag, saved the king. We know that this happened because the grateful monarch gifted the Clan Mackenzie new lands and titles, gave them a castle, which remains their ancestral seat to this day. But most important for us as whiskey fans, gave the Mackenzie clan the sole right of all the Highland clans to use the symbol of the 12-point stag on their clan crest, which obviously they did very proudly. Flash forward a few centuries. In 1867, Andrew and Charles Mackenzie take over the Dalmore from the founder and go on to own the distillery for well over a century. And the first thing they do is put their Mackenzie stag on their whiskey. That's the reason for this gleaming silver stag on every bottle of the Dalmore. And the reason, if you're ever so lucky to encounter it and try it, why we named one of our most special expressions the King Alexander III.
Yeah. And
nice little history lesson there.
I do believe that, if I'm not mistaken, that there is a King Alexander that is not sold out on the website. So if you're looking for it, you may be able to go out there and go to Reserve Bar and check. It starts at $289.99. Probably going to be a little bit more than that, but it is available potentially.
It's a lovely one. First single malt Scotch whiskey in the world to use 6 different types of casks in the finishing process. So really utilizing all that expertise that we've built over the decades with, sourcing special wine casks.
Mm.
So I got to ask,
sounds delightful.
Here in the States, we talk about master distillers, master blenders with the Dalmore.
Yeah.
Is it a blending team, or like where how does this whiskey end up in this glass?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a blending team. I mean, it wouldn't be fair to give credit to one person for something like this. I mean, there's a distillery team. There's, the guys that are in the managing the stocks in the warehouse. There's the guys in the still house. There's a lot of components here, but the master blender of the Dalmore, the master distiller of the Dalmore, for well over 50 years, was a gentleman named Richard Patterson. It's one of the most famous names in Scotch whiskey, a real legend of the industry. He's a 3rd generation master blender, and has been tremendously important to me as a mentor and a friend, and as the guy who made a lot of these whiskeys that I fell in love with. Richard is winding down his career with us and has handed the baton to a gentleman named Gregg Glass, who was previously with Compass Box, making a lot of those really fantastic, innovative, really cool whiskeys with John Glaser. And Greg is bringing a lot of that excitement and an eye to try different things to Whyte Mackay and to our portfolio. So he's working hand in hand with Richard these days, as Richard sort of winds down his time with us. But Richard is the reason why we have a lot of those relationships with the wineries, because he's just over these decades established personal friendships and secured access to these casks, and has really put his style of whiskey making on what we do at this distillery. So I'm sure we'll be in good stead with Greg. Greg was largely responsible for the 14 year. In a lot of ways, this is his baby, and looking forward to what he's going to do with our crown jewel at Whyte and Mackay going forward.
Yeah, and Jake, I know I was hoping you would lead into that, which is great. But Jake and I always talk about how some people in the whiskey industry have spilled more whiskey than we'll have ever drank. And Richard
does it on purpose.
Does it on purpose. Every tasting. He, if you've ever caught videos on the internet, he's well known for basically tossing his whiskey across the room. Yep. Which is just so unique. And I'm glad that you brought that up. But that's kind of where I was heading. He's an icon. And if you don't know who he is, you have to look him up. And
please, awesome. Please do. Please go look up Richard Patterson on YouTube and have a great time. He's one of a kind. He is one of the loveliest men in an industry that's full of lovely people. One of the reasons why I love the Scotch whiskey industry so much. But Richard is really, I think the saying is they broke the mold, right? When they made him. Yeah. To give a little more context to what you were saying, Richard is famous for pouring whiskey into a glass, pouring some, whatever it is, whatever he's got, anything from, a Jura 10-year-old to, a rare bottle of 50-year-old Dalmore that's about to break records at auction. He'll pour a little bit in the glass and swirl it around and then dash it on the floor. So, two reasons for that. One is the reason he gives, and the other is the reason that I've surmised years of working with him. The reason he gives, when he does that, he's coated his glass with the whiskey so that when he goes back and pours a little more, he's not going to get any off notes, anything that might have been residual from the cleaning agents that were used in the glass or was left out in a musty room or whatever. I mean, the man has a very sensitive nose that was insured for a lot of money. In fact, his nickname is the Nose. So that's the practical reason. The presentation reason that I've learned over the years is you have to understand that Richard was working as not only a whiskey blender, but really a whiskey ambassador around the world for longer than we've been alive. And so imagine being in a place where people don't know anything about Scotch whiskey. They don't know anything about single malt. They may not even speak English as a first language. And you've got to get their attention and make them excited about, what you're there to talk about. And one thing that'll certainly do it is you take out this whiskey that everyone thinks you're going to be very precious with, and you pour it in and swirl it around and then chuck it. Everyone goes, "Oh, what the heck's going on here?" You've got their attention. Yeah. So Richard's a showman, but there was good reason for that too. I mean, he definitely will pick up on any off notes. So he'll coat the glass with the whiskey that he's chucked.
That's hilarious. And if I started chucking whiskey around the house, my wife would be like, "Did the dog pee, or did you start doing some stupid shit?"
Yeah. It made for a lot of fun visits to the U.S. Because I would have to gauge. He'll do it anywhere. He'll chuck whiskey, at the MoMA. He'll do it at the Louvre. It doesn't matter. But you have to, if you pull him aside and say, "Richard, if you throw whiskey here, we're both going to get kicked out." He won't do it. But if you forget to tell him, he'll do it no matter where he's at.
Love it.
Yeah, it's on you at the end of the day.
Oh, yeah. Man, that's awesome. Well, and that's a great way to wrap up tonight's just awesome opportunity to hang out with you, Craig. We would be remiss if you didn't share a little bit about where people could learn more about the Dalmore, here in the U.S., but just internationally as well.
Well, thanks for asking that question. I would encourage anybody who's interested to go to our website, thedalmore.com, and you can get stuck in on our heritage and the story of the Mackenzies and the unique cask curation process that we specialize in. I also think avail yourself to the experts that you know. If you have a whiskey group or a whiskey club in your city that gets together, and there's somebody who loves Dalmore, that individual will be a great resource. Or a whiskey bar with a bartender or a beverage manager that's really made it their business to get well educated. Those are resources that have served me well in my life as just a whiskey fan. So I would recommend that. I would also say that I work with a small team of single malt specialists for the Dalmore and Jura in key cities across the country. And if you if you live in one of those, hopefully you can reach out to or run into one of them. I have a single malt specialist in Los Angeles that looks after California and also gets out to Las Vegas on the regular. I have a gentleman in Dallas, covers Texas and gets up to Colorado whenever he can. There's a chap in Florida. There's another in North Carolina looking after some markets in the Midwest and in the what we call the NABCA markets, or some of those control states, Ohio, North Carolina, Virginia. And then there's a gentleman in New York and one in New Jersey. So we're out there. And we love to talk whiskey. So I guess off the top of my head, those are my suggestions to learn more.
Yeah. Well, Craig, we couldn't be more thankful for you joining and spending, an hour and a half with us here tonight on the Bourbon Lens. And as always, thanks everyone for listening to this episode. If you want to know more about us, go over to bourbonlens.com, or you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And as always, we'd much appreciate it if you go to your favorite podcast listening app and give us a 5-star review. We truly appreciate it. And until next time, cheers.
Cheers.
Bon jovi, guys. Thanks so much.